This is going to be part one in my new series on restoring a 1977 to 1985 Mercedes diesel. And it's going to focus on doing a rolling restoration. By rolling restoration, I mean the car runs and drives but has a lot of problems, and you're going to restore it little by little. That's the case with this car here. If you've seen my previous series on reviving a dead diesel, welcome to Old Spence. Old Spence will be a model through much of this series. But the first thing you want to do is start out with safety issue related problems. I drove this car and I didn't like the way the brakes felt. The suspension's tight. The suspension's tight, track straight down the road. I can tell it's had recent shock absorbers put on it. Those are other safety related issues, but the brakes. Now, almost every one of these old 77 to 85 diesels need brake work. I mean, they're all 40 years old or thereabouts, and unless you have maintenance records, the brake work's been done. And I've gotten cars that have had, quote, professional brake work done on them. Oh my word, you don't want to know about those stories. But anyway, back to this. You want to do a complete brake service. Most of the time, the calipers are going to be bad. The flexible brake hoses very seldom get changed. And the brake discs are going to be all rusty. On my workbench here, I have everything laid out that I'm going to do. All these items I carry on my website. You can buy all the parts you need to do this yourself. I have manuals, I have videos on replacing all the brake components, right down to replacing a master cylinder. Now I've got a master cylinder here and a master cylinder bleeding kit. I don't know if I'm going to need a master cylinder yet. That'll come after I use the pressure brake bleeder to bleed the system and just see how the pedal feels. Then I'll know whether or not I have to change the master cylinder. But pads, hoses, rotors, and I even pulled out some emergency brake shoes because I would say 80% of the time when I pull these rear discs off, I'm going to show you that in a minute. We'll just pull them off together and see. But I bet you, anybody want to bet me $10 they're shot? You know, people say, well, it's not an emergency brake. It's only a parking brake. Who cares? Well, it can be emergency brake in some situations if you lose your brake fluid in both systems. Okay, but whether I call it an emergency brake or parking brake, it still needs to work properly. So who knows what is going to reside in here. And what I'm going to do in this video is I'm not going to go through the whole sequence of replacing brakes. I've done probably 12 videos on this, and there's all kinds of videos on YouTube. People get tired of seeing videos on brake work. All I'm going to do in this video, as it relates to this rolling restoration, is I'm going to go around and just show you a few tips that'll make your job easier. I'm not going to show you every single step. Remember, if you buy these components from Mercedessource, you're going to get instructions with them, and that'll really help. So let's start out, and I'll share with you a number of tips as I go through fixing the brakes here on Old Spence. The first tip I want to share with you is before you do anything, wash all your brakes down. Get an old bucket of soapy water like we have here. Get a paintbrush and just wash everything and then rinse it. Get rid of all that brake dust because you do not want to be breathing that while you're working on the brakes. And here's another tip or recommendation I want to share. Anytime you're working on the rear brakes for the first time, I recommend you remove the brake disc and check the condition of your parking brake shoes. Look, no shoe left. I see this so often because it's like people never even inspect these. Both sides. The shoes are gone. The next tip I want to share with you is really important. When you go to change the flexible brake hoses or remove these rear calipers, do not let all the old fluid leak out. Most people just disconnect everything, put a pen underneath and let it drip away. Well, problem is, if you let all the fluid drip out, you're going to have a harder time bleeding the system. I like to leave as much original fluid in the system while I'm working on the brakes, so when I go to bleed it, I don't have to get rid of a lot of air. So as soon as this comes out, notice we're using a flare nut wrench there, so we don't round off that 11 millimeter brake line nut. But you can see we're losing fluid already. Look at that. But not much. The trick is to get that out quickly and then take a silicone plug. You have to pull that line out and then put that plug up in there just like that. See that? All right, the dripping has stopped. Now we've trapped that old fluid in there, And we'll leave it like that until we put the new brake line on. This is what the parking brake shoes should look like. New ones are installed on the right side, but installing them is not as easy as it appears. You're going to need a special tool or you're going to go nuts. Getting those center springs out. I remember the first time I tried to do it with a pair of needle nose. You have to go through the hole and you get on the end of the spring like that, and then you have to compress it and turn it to get those springs off. But that's not the only problem you have getting these shoes off. You have to deal with a spring at the top and a spring down here at the bottom, and this tool can also aid in removing those springs and reinstalling them. Now, I said earlier that I've seen a lot of neglected parking brake shoes, but this is the worst. They've been gone so long that you have flaky rust built up on the backings. The next tip I want to share is alerting you to the importance of getting all this rust off the flat surface of the hub before you put the new disc in place. If you don't do that, the disc may not seat properly and you can have a shimmy occur doing heavy braking. When I show you all this, you'll understand why I was complaining about Old Spence's brakes not working very well. They worked, but you could tell by the feedback in the pedal that something wasn't right. First off, we replaced these rear calipers. One of the pistons was sticking on each side. The hoses, of course, were cracked like that, so you wanted to replace those. And I was kind of hoping, being Dutch, I told you, so I hope we can save those front calipers. We'll just replace the rear ones. And you know, look at this. We replaced the rotor with a coated rotor. That's a Zimmerman rotor. We replaced the flexible brake line. We had to pull the disc off, replace the brake shoes. Look at these brake shoes. Oh man, I've seen bad brake shoes, but I don't know if I've ever seen any quite this bad. So we replaced the brake shoes, almost everything on the back end. And when we got up to the front end, we pulled these. I don't think I've ever seen this one. Look at that. The metal plate separated from the disc material in here. And that's kind of glued on. Yeah, this is the first time I've seen this one. Look at that. That's the material just falling apart. I think what's happening, you can see that both of these calipers were probably leaking a little bit, and that's what deteriorated this one pad. Also kind of gummed up the front brake disc, but we looked at those front brake discs and they look fine. You can see they're vented. Of course, you need vented rotors on a 123 turbo diesel for performance, of course, right? We ended up having to replace the front calipers too, the pads, the hoses. So other than just those front discs, look at the rear discs. You know, they weren't too bad, but you get in here and they're badly worn inside from these parking brake shoes wearing metal on metal back there. If you're going to consider to do this to your old W123, because of the age, I recommend don't skimp, just replace everything. You're probably looking at around $800 from the various parts and kits that I offer. And if you do this yourself, if you don't do this yourself, take it into a shop, expect it to be probably $2,000 plus. So you can save a lot by doing your own brake work. So next, I'm going to lower the car down a little bit and we're going to hook up the pressure brake bleeder and we're going to bleed the system. I know this is not brake or safety related, but I thought I'd just show this to you in passing. I just really do not like looking at rusty wheel bolts. And all 20 of these were rusty. So I had another set in my used parts stash, and look what I did. It takes very little time. Get a wire wheel, clean these up, and stick them in some cardboard. Make sure they're clean, and then spray them with silver alloy wheel paint. And just a word of caution, don't get the paint on too thick. Just a couple of light coats. If you get the paint on too thick, the wrench is going to chip the paint off. When you paint them like you see here, these will stay looking good for a long time. There are a number of reasons why I prefer using a pressure tank like this to bleed the brake system. Number one, particularly on these old cars, you're not over-exercising the master cylinder, possibly ruining the seals. That master cylinder's old, you're not sure whether the seals have ever traveled to where they will travel when you start pumping it up and down, so that eliminates that potential. The other thing is, this is a one-man operation. I can pump pressure up, make sure there's no leaks, and that's very important. If you haven't done this before, you can get leaks out of here or leaks out of the cap. So when you start to build pressure the first time, run it up to about 5 psi and stop. And take a real close look here and make sure you're not leaking any brake fluid anywhere around here. If you are, it's just going to create a mess. Once you're sure that it's holding pressure, then take it up to about 12 psi. You don't want to go too high, because if you do blow a line, you're going to have brake fluid all over the place. So I usually use 10 to 12 psi. And as I go around from one wheel, I start in the right rear and then go to the left rear and then go to the right front and then go to the left front. I come back after each wheel and I just build the pressure back up to 10 to 12 psi and continue on. And you can't believe how fast and efficient bleeding your brakes with this is. I just finished bleeding the brakes on Old Spence with what you see here, and it took about 10 minutes. There's a couple things I want to point out. You can usually get by with 1 liter of DOT4 brake fluid. 1 liter, unless the system is extremely dirty. Now I put 1 liter in the pressure tank, and you can see how much is left. There's just a little bit on the bottom there. And in this capture bottle, this is how much came out of all 4 calipers. I started out in the rear. I have more fluid come out in the rear than I do in the front, because there's more dirty fluid in those long lines going to the rear. So for the first 2 rear calipers, I take out about 1 inch, and then up front maybe a 1/2 inch of old fluid. Don't skimp on the flush. You know, run at least 1 liter through there, unless it's been done in the last few years. Most of the time you'll find this brake fluid dark and dirty and hasn't been changed in years. So we're done. The car's sitting over there nice and pretty with its newly painted wheels. I know the rest of the car looks kind of bad. But we'll get ready to roll this out on the road and test the brake system, and then we're going to move on to all the exterior and interior lighting.